What is Christian hope? That's the subject we're going to be talking about today. And here we are in the middle of this, pandemic and so much turbulence, and maybe an awakening to the injustices in our world. And we want to know, what is God going to do about it? What's our hope even as Christians as we think through all of this? And so a lot of this in my book, Worship in the World to Come, you see that on the slide there. This book releases in a couple weeks. And I can give you a little cheater's reading guide for the book. There's a couple of chapters that if you're a musician or an artist, you'd be like, oh, those chapters are the ones I'm really interested in. If you're more on the theological side, I could say, these 4 chapters are the ones you really need to lean in on. And if you're an academic, you might like all of it. It is written. It's my dissertation stuff, but rewritten for church leaders, for people, lay leaders, staff members, whatever the case may be, who are interested in exploring the subject of hope and Christian worship. Tonight, we're going to essentially deal with 3 chapters in the book that discuss hope. And in the book, it's chapters 3, 4, and 5, part 2, hope and eschatology. What is hope? What is Christian hope? And what is Christian hope? Part 2. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, and we're going to start by actually just saying, what is hope from a human perspective? When we think about just the various ways of conceiving of hope. And so the first thing I want to explore is models for hope that are not theological, models that are not automatically Christian. They're not necessarily secular. They're just not the discipline of theology. And so we're going to look at a few of these models. The first couple that we're going to look at could be described as psychological perspectives or models for hope. The cognitive and the affective. Cognitive obviously has to do with our state of mind and our mental processes. What does hope look like in terms of how we think? But the affective, that has to do with our affections or emotions, if you will. And so we'll talk about hope from the perspective of emotions. What does hope feel like? And then we'll dive into hope as virtue ethics. Is there something here about hope that helps us think about the ethics of the character quality itself? I just had this thought that people might be waiting to come in, and I don't know if I can see if people are coming in. Okay. I wonder if there's a way to just make sure allow. Yeah. Okay. Just disable the waiting room so now they can just come in right away. Okay. Hopefully that helps. All right. Back to it. Perspectives and models of hope. And then we'll also look at the phenomenological. Sorry, let's go back one slide. The phenomenological model of hope, which is really about hope as an act. And then we'll get into the theological, early Christian, and then contemporary. So let's now get into this here. The cognitive model of hope. Hope as a state of being or a state of mind. There's a psychologist named Charles Snyder, and Snyder talks about hope in a cognitive sense as being about agency and pathway. And what he means by this is agency is the sense that you can, that you're able, that you have the ability. And then pathway is about a plan. If you think about social situations, when a person does not have the agency to improve their state of being, they're going to be hopeless because they'll say, I can't do anything about this. I'm stuck. I don't have control. Or if they say, well, I'm trying, but I don't have the pathway. The pathway is being blocked. In fact, one of the things that has come up as we've talked about the lingering effects of injustices and discrimination is we've essentially seen that African Americans have been blocked in terms of both agency and pathway. And we can talk about voting rights. We can talk about neighborhood stuff. We can talk about access to education and earning. And so when Snyder says hope is about agency plus pathway, if a person does not have agency or pathway, they're going to feel a sense of despair. A couple years ago when I read Hillbilly Elegy, he talked about the Rust Belt and some places of poverty there. And he talks about this as this sense of people did not know how to break out of the cycle and to get out of that pattern. So when there's no agency or pathway, there's no hope. Another way of thinking about agency and pathway is what Snyder calls willpower and way power. Willpower, the sense that you can do it. Way power, the sense that you know how. But then the critique here of Snyder's model is there's really no difference between his model of hope and what we might call optimism. The challenge here is Snyder doesn't say anything about our actual basis for hope, our actual ground. So think for a minute. A person could just have a lot of confidence, and they could say, oh yeah, I can do that. I mean, I got 4 kids, my younger kids especially, like, oh, I can do that. I know how to do that. They might have a sense of believing that they have agency, but actually they don't. And so there's little here to distinguish between what if our mind is playing tricks on us? What if it's just a mind over matter and we tell ourselves, yeah, I can do it and I know how, but we keep running up against a brick wall. So there's one's appraisal of their own agency or pathway may be inaccurate. And therefore this model of hope is good, but ultimately flawed because it doesn't distinguish between hope and optimism. Snyder says here, I say this about Snyder in the book. Charles Snyder constructed a cognitive model of hope as the result of agency and pathway. Hope is defined as the perceived capability to derive pathways to desired goals. In other words, you can imagine the way to get to the goal that you have in mind and motivate oneself via agency thinking to use those pathways. So you think of the pathway and then you think, I can do that. Snyder has alternatively described agency and pathways, willpower and way power, respectively. In those terms, hope is, quote, the sum of the mental willpower and way power that you have for your goals. So obviously very human-centered and doesn't account for our own tendency to misjudge our abilities. And secondly, it doesn't account for the fact that we often run into stumbling blocks when we want to change our situations. All right, let's move on. The strengths and weaknesses of that. So we've covered some of this. The strengths are, it gives us some specific language to think about hope even from a human perspective. And so if maybe you're doing work in the community and you say, how do we help bring hope to people? Well, in a very practical way, return a sense of agency to them, give them the power, and then return a sense of pathway to them, unimpede the barriers toward their goals. So those are strengths of this model. But again, the weaknesses are it will ultimately run against problems that we cannot solve. Okay. Let's go to the next model of hope, the affective model of hope. This is about hope as an emotional experience. Here we have a philosopher named Bob Roberts. Bob Roberts retired from Baylor University after teaching many years as a moral philosopher. And he did a lot of work on emotions and emotions as perceptions. We're going to read a quote from Roberts in just a moment. And then there's also a little bit that we interact with the psychologist Paul Ekman. Now, if that name sounds a bit familiar, if you have kids and you've watched the movie Inside Out, Ekman was the scientist who was consulted for all of that science on emotions in Inside Out. He's also, if you remember a couple of years ago on Fox, there was a TV show called Lie to Me. Ekman was the psychologist that they consulted because Ekman studied emotions. Basically, Ekman studied emotions all around the world, even in remote tribes in New Guinea that had not been exposed to media. And he concludes that there are essentially 6 universal human emotions. And we can talk about that some other time. It's fascinating work that Ekman has done. So let's look at this quote here from Roberts first about what emotions are. Bob Roberts writes that emotions are a concern-based construal, a way of perceiving the world rooted in the concerns one has. Roberts adds that emotions have perceptual immediacy, meaning they arise pre-reflectively. Okay, that's a lot of jargon, but this is basically what it means. You look outside, it's raining. If your response, your pre-reflective, your just sort of automatic response to the rain is, yeah, it's raining. It could be that you live in Colorado and you're concerned about wildfires and you don't want there to be fire bans the next time you go camping. And so you're just pumped. So your concern for there to be no wildfires makes you perceive rain in a positive way, and so your emotional response is joy. If you were hoping to go to the beach or something and it's raining, your immediate response will be, oh, sadness or anger because your goal has been blocked. So Roberts is saying that emotions actually reveal the thing that we're concerned about. It construes the world. We perceive the world in a particular way based on something we care about. Psychologist Paul Ekman attributes this to brain functions that he calls auto-appraisers as a construal or perception. Emotions also represent a particular interpretation of a scenario. As interpretive perceptions, emotions help make sense of a situation. I think this is important for us as Christians. Sometimes we've sort of thought that emotions are bad, like we shouldn't listen to our emotions. Actually, emotions are a really wonderful way of thinking, reflecting backwards. You can kind of reverse engineer it. If emotions are already automatic responses to a situation, we can kind of go backwards and say, so what is my emotion? What are my emotions telling me? Maybe they're telling me that I really care about this, or that I really, this is really important to me. Something important to our welfare is the quote. So emotions contain a motivational power. That means hope can function like an emotion. Hope has an emotional component to it. We don't have to conclude that Christian hope is, cerebral and then it's just theological. No, Christian hope feels like something. We can feel, it might even feel like joy, or might even feel like a comfort. There's another scholar named Christopher Peterson who is I think also a psychologist, not a secular psychologist actually, and he says optimism, though not strictly an emotion, is related to emotions in a specific way. Christopher Peterson, an expert on optimism, posits that optimism is an attitude about the likelihood of experiencing enjoyable emotions. In other words, optimism is you're assessing a situation and you're like, I think I'm going to experience some positive, some enjoyable emotions here in a moment. In a description that is resonant with Snyder's cognitive model of hope as agency and pathway, Ekman notes that optimism is found in people who have more enjoyment in their lives, greater perseverance, higher achievements. So this is interesting because here we're saying, if you know how to enjoy life, if you know how to persevere, if you're able to sort of press through, again, agency plus pathway, achieving your goals, that's going to give you greater confidence, a greater sense of agency, a greater sense of pathway, confidence for the next thing, therefore a greater sense of optimism. Peterson suggests that optimism results in desired outcomes because it produces a general state of vigor and resilience. So what I want to say is, even though Christian hope is more than optimism, optimism itself is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to say, well, yeah, I generally go through life sort of with a kind of confidence that things are going to work out, or that, and actually, and we'll fill this in later, a Christian might say a mix of things. They might say something like this: God is with me no matter what I face, therefore I can persevere and persist. And that gives you the kind of vigor and resilience to make it through different situations. So the strengths of the affective model of hope is we can think about hope as an emotional experience. We can think about our feelings, and it helps us understand where we're going with this, and how we're able to maybe even say, if I am feeling confident, well, what does this tell me about the things that I care about? And what does this tell me about future situations? The weakness is, of course, emotions, even good emotions, don't last forever. And so hope for the Christian needs to be more than that. And now we come to the next model of hope, hope as a virtue. Hope not just as an experience, hope not just as a state of mind, but hope as a virtue, as a character quality. The object of Christian hope is fixed, but the experience of hope may fluctuate. So let me say that again. The object of Christian hope is fixed, but the experience of it will fluctuate. So there is a sense in which the emotional model of hope helps us to know, okay, yeah, we're gonna experience this, and it's nice to have that uplift experience and that uplift feeling. But at the end of the day, even when the feelings fade, even when the feelings go away, we need to have a fixedness to our hope. moods, this is an interesting side note about moods versus emotions. Moods have no objects, meaning they're not about anything. If you ever wake up on a Monday morning and you're just in a bad mood, and your spouse or your roommate, whatever, says, "What's the matter with you?" And you say, I don't know. Nothing's happened yet. That's a mood. A mood has no object. But emotions actually have objects. Emotions are about something. So they're about something, but they're episodic. They come and they go. But emotions can develop into a character trait through endurance. And this is where we look at Roberts again, and to say that actually, if you will allow this emotion of hope in God, maybe you're in a worship service, you experience a sense of hope. Guess what? Monday's coming, and you're going to be tested. It's going to come under fire. It's not going to always feel like that Sunday morning. The saying is, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. Well, the reverse is also true. It's Sunday, but Friday's coming. There's a crucifixion and a suffering that's coming. But here is the opportunity for Christians: is that experience of hope. It might have been short-lived because of an emotion, but you can turn it. It doesn't have to stay as just an emotion. It can actually morph into a character quality, a virtue. How? Through endurance. This is why Romans says that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. That the suffering of our faith can actually turn the emotional lift of optimism and general positivity. It can go beyond positive psychology. It can go beyond optimism. Suffering can produce perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And this is the idea that now we're getting closer and closer to the Christian model of hope. But there's one more piece to look at, and that is the phenomenological model. Now, that is a gigantic word. For years, I had no idea what people were saying when they said phenomenological. It's just a fancy way of saying it's the act of, the event of, the phenomenon of actually hoping. And when you tear it apart and analyze it, you can actually say there are many elements of hope. Many sort of structural elements. A Christian philosopher named James K.A. Smith talked about this in an essay that he wrote, a chapter in a book, and he breaks it down to actually have these structural elements. Anytime there's hope, there's got to be a hoper, aka the subject. Who's the person hoping for something? That's you and me. There's got to be an object. What are you hoping in, or what are you hoping for? And Smith points out the object has to be future, and it has to be good. Now, why? Because if it's not future, it's not hope. It's just reality. It's right here. And if it's not good, but it is in the future, that's not hope. That's fear. When something's in the future but it's not good, what you're feeling about that is called fear, not hope. But hope, it says the object of my hope is in the future and it's good. And then he says there has to be a kind of consciousness to it, that hope doesn't happen accidentally. Hope, you don't wake up in the morning all of a sudden and be like, well, I hope. There's a consciousness to it. So again, contrast this with emotions. We said that emotions were pre-reflective, automatic responses. And here we're saying that no, hope has to be conscious. For it to go beyond an emotional experience, it's got to be conscious. And then it's got to have a ground. It's got to have a basis. And this was, again, our critique of Snyder and the cognitive model of hope. Why would Snyder only say that it's agency and pathway? Because what if you don't, your appraisal of yourself is not accurate? Then all of a sudden you're saying, yeah, I think I can do this. I think I've got it, but you're not actually accurate. There's got to be some kind of ground, some kind of basis for this. And then finally, hope for the Christian has to have fulfillment. Why? Because if it doesn't have fulfillment, then it's just a wish. So now we're beginning to refine the picture of what hope has to have. If it doesn't have grounds, it's just optimism. If it doesn't have a conscious act, then it's just an emotion. If it doesn't have an object, it's just a vague mood. If it doesn't have fulfillment, it's just a wish. So you got to have all of these elements for it to actually be hope. So now we get into the theological model, hope as eschatological vision. In theological terms, eschatology gets this bad rap. Eschatology, we think, is about the end times, and it's about the dragon and the beast and all of that. No, eschatology really is about last things. But a better way to think of it is the final act. What is the final act? Or maybe an even better way to think of it is, what is the goal that God is moving creation toward? What is the goal that God has in mind for you and for me? There's a Greek word called telos. And in Romans 10:4, it says that Jesus is the telos of the law. Jesus is where the law was moving toward. It's where the story of the Old Testament was always heading. And in a very real way, eschatology is teleology. It's about the telos of the creation. Where is the creation moving toward? So let's begin. And I deliberately chose not to just do a survey of the biblical verses on hope. I think that's extremely important. But I think you could do that on your own. You could word search hope and read all the New Testament scriptures, read the Old Testament. The Psalms are full of references to hope, and that's very, very important. But I want us to look at a theological lens as opposed to a purely kind of biblical studies lens where we look at Bible verses. We're going to look at how early Christians first began to understand the theology of hope. In Brian Daly's book, The Hope of the Early Church, he outlines some important things. And so here's a quote again from Worship in the World to Come. Forgive all the multiple book plugs. Brian Daly points out that it is clear from the beginning of Christian literature that hope for the future is an inseparable, integral dimension of Christian faith and the implied condition of possibility for responsible Christian action in the world. So he's talking about the importance of hope to the Christian faith, that you can't really have this notion of faith without a sense of hope. In other words, while the specifics of what is being hoped for and how or when it will come about may vary, the presence of hope is undeniable within Christianity. It occupies a central place. And he's saying this from the beginning, from the early Christian writings about hope, even beyond the New Testament. And then he says, second, the patristic writers, this is the early church fathers, so we're talking about the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, insists in a crescendo of consensus, I love that quote, that Christians live with this hope within history and thus carry a sense of realism. What he means by that is the Christian hope is not, oh, it's somewhere else up there. It's happening somewhere else. And one day we'll get to join the action up there. No. He's saying God is active and at work within human history. And so for the Christian, hope is a sense of realism. And we're gonna talk about this when we get a little bit further into the seminar here in just a couple more slides, in fact. Thus, the centrality of hope and its quality of realism, which locates itself within history, are part of the fabric of the Christian faith common to the early church. The hope of the early church, there's some areas of agreement. Now, you might imagine that with such diversity of theologians and church fathers and mothers, did they really agree on much? Actually, they agreed on a lot of things. And we're going to look at a couple of them, 5 of them right now. For one, there was this linear view of history, the sense that history is moving towards something. So what I said earlier about a telos, the teleology, there's an end goal that God has in mind. This is in contrast, by the way, to the 1st century kind of philosophy religion called Gnosticism. The Gnostics did not believe in the temporal world. They thought that the temporal world would sort of dissolve and there was something else. And it's also in contrast to one particular church theologian named Origen who wondered if time was just cyclical. Now, I grew up in the East. The Hindu view of history, if you will, is cyclical. The Buddhist view is a little bit like that with reincarnation. So the Christians, and like the Jews before them, have a linear version of history. I'll show you some graphs in a moment to make this clear. They also all believed in the resurrection of the body. Now, this is important because how often do you hear Christians today talking about the resurrection of the body? Not very often. Most often when we talk about our future, what do we talk about? Heaven. We talk about what's going to happen one day. Now, heaven is real. Heaven is for real, as that book and story and movie and all of that's true, but it's not the final end of the story. As the theologian, New Testament scholar N.T. Wright has joked, heaven is important, but it's not the end of the world. Literally, it's not the end of the story. And early Christians looked forward to our resurrection of the body, our bodily resurrection. And then thirdly, the other common doctrine was the notion of the prospect of judgment, that God was coming to judge the earth. This view, it led to some speculation eventually with, is there an interim state? If you died, would there be a second chance? And there was some speculation about all that. But the place of agreement, however, was that whatever we say, there is going to be a judgment where people will be sorted out. And whether or not there's second chances and all that, there was some speculation. Fourthly, there was also the promise of retribution. Now, this is an interesting thing because we don't want to think about that. We don't want to think about judgment or vengeance or retribution, a sense of reward for the righteous and punishment for the wicked. But actually, this is an important thing. We cannot believe in justice and not also believe in judgment. And this is where Christians will sometimes depart. So when we work for justice, we might have a lot of allies that are non-Christians. It'll say, yes, we are all for justice. But when we start talking about judgment and a moral standard and how that there's a God who just separates the sheep from the goats and will punish the wicked and reward those who put their faith in him, and now all of a sudden, some people who are not Christians might say, whoa, we don't know if we can get on board with that. But for the early Christians, there is no justice without judgment. There is no return of Christ without also a sense of retribution, a weighing of the scales, if you will, of human life. And then finally, the fifth common element of early Christian hope was that they believed in the communion of saints, the sense that the saints who are with the Lord now, even in paradise, that there can be a kind of nearness. Now, again, it's not the same as asking the saints to pray for us, and of course, Christians began to be different about this, but just the sense that when we worship, when we come together, we're joining the saints in heaven. There was also, of course, some areas of disagreement. They disagreed about the timing of the end of the world. Surprise, surprise. They disagreed about the nature of the resurrected body. Why, silly sort of questions, similar maybe questions about what we would have. What age are we going to be? Is the resurrection body more spiritual or more physical? We don't fully know. They also disagreed about the extent of salvation. What I mean is, will all people eventually be saved? And this has to do with the whole idea of judgment and second chances. There's some speculation of, will God find a way to rescue everyone with ultimate second chances? There's some disagreement there. The possibility of progress after judgment, that relates to that. And then, of course, 3, 4, and 5 all sort of go together, the existence of purgatory. So those are areas we cannot dive into tonight, but those are there for the early church. Okay. When you think about how the early church summed up their belief, their eschatology, their hope, you've got the Nicene Creed. The hope of the early church can be found in the 2 key phrases in the Nicene Creed. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. Christ will come. He's going to come in glory. He's going to come to judge. And then the last line of the creed, we look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Here is the emphatic hope that our bodies will be raised up and the life of the world to come. There is a world to come that we will experience as new creation. Okay, let me pause here and check everything, make sure we're doing okay. Let's see what's happening in the chat. Yes. Comments. Okay, very good. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I'm hoping there's no one in the waiting room. Let's stop the share for a minute and just make sure. Okay, we're good. All right, let's go back to the share. And we're now going to look at some contemporary theologians, 2 of my favorites, N.T. Wright and Jurgen Moltmann. And we're going to look at where they agree. And I'll try to say this briefly and sum this up so that we can save room for questions and comments. There's 6 areas of agreement. The first area is the idea of the primacy of Jewish eschatology. There's so much that can be said. Chapter 5 of the book really gets into it and maps out item by item of this. Basically, both Moltmann and Wright are building their vision of Christian eschatology from Jewish eschatology. Moltmann talks a lot about resurrection as a salvific hope and judgment. He talks also about creation that began in time and is completed in space. Moltmann uses these concepts of a great Sabbath and a great Shekinah. The glory of God will descend upon the world, the great Shekinah of God, and the great Sabbath of God, when creation will find its true rest. Wright talks about kind of how actually it looks different than what Jewish people would have imagined. In fact, they thought of resurrection as happening at the end of time for everyone. But here, Jesus, one person in advance of everyone else, receives resurrection. That's an interesting development. And he talks about kind of 3 different positions regarding the afterlife that the Old Testament kind of proposes. And there's so much here that we can't fully dive into, but just to say that Wright does a lot of work to show that the Christian vision of resurrection could not have emerged automatically from Jewish theology. So even though it comes from Jewish eschatology more than anyone else, and in fact, sometimes critics say, oh, it's from ancient Zoroastrianism or Canaanite mythology, and Wright says, no, you don't understand how important resurrection language was to Jewish eschatology. It symbolized the return of Israel to the promised land after exile. So there's a lot of this imagery of sin equals death and exile, and return from exile equals resurrection. You see this, by the way, when Jesus is telling the story of the prodigal son, and he says, my son who was dead is now alive. That's kind of an idea of Israel in exile and then come back. Resurrection equals the return from exile, the forgiveness of sins and all that. But again, no one imagined that one person in advance of everyone else, the Messiah, would suffer, die, and be raised up. So it draws on it and yet is different from it. And so for both Moltmann and Wright, the centrality of Christ's resurrection is the key. Jesus's resurrection kind of becomes the means and the model of all things. In fact, Moltmann says Christianity stands or falls with the reality of the raising of Jesus from the dead by God. Everything rises and falls on the resurrection. Everything gets read through that, gets interpreted through that. Wright, turning to Pauline theology, Paul's theology, says that you cannot understand what happened to make Jewish hope into Christian hope, how the Christian vision of the end changes. You can't even begin to imagine that if Jesus himself had not been raised from the dead. And so Wright makes this fantastic argument in his thick book, Resurrection and the Son of God, that the only way we arrive at the Christian vision of hope is because Jesus himself was actually raised from the dead. This, of course, is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So, okay, we'll have to speed up a little bit. The paradigm for the resurrection of the dead. And so when we want to know, well, what is our resurrection going to be like? We have to say, well, we look back at Jesus as not only central to our concept of hope, but actually paradigmatic. He is the paradigm for understanding the resurrection of the dead. There's a great quote from Moltmann. Moltmann says, the immortality of the soul is an opinion. And basically, it was Plato's opinion. It was a Greek theory. But the resurrection of the dead is a hope. I love that. Moltmann is saying, look, the first is a trust in just the nature of human beings, that, oh, we're immortal, so the soul will live on. But Jewish people did not believe that. Christians did not believe in an immortal soul. In fact, in the New Testament, it says, to the only immortal God. We are not immortal. We live forever because we are in Christ who lives forever. So Moltmann says the belief in an immortal soul, that's a trust in the nature of the human being. But resurrection from the dead, that's a hope that comes from trust in the God who calls into being the things that are not and makes the dead live. What a sentence from Moltmann. And of course, Wright has said similar things. Wright's thesis on the redemption of our bodies is simply this: the risen Jesus is both the model for the Christian's future body and the means by which it comes about. So when you want to know, will it be this body that gets changed? Yes. Look at Jesus. It was his actual body that had the scars in it that was transformed by resurrection. So that's how we think about our own resurrected bodies. Fourthly, the paradigm of the renewal of creation. So the resurrection of Jesus is also how we think about new creation. Will creation be destroyed? Yes. Will creation be renewed and become new creation? Yes. You're like, well, how? Think about Jesus, who died and was raised up. So the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus actually become a paradigm for understanding the renewal of creation itself. So if people only emphasize one thing or the other, they'll get it wrong. If they only say, oh, we're going into a new creation, as if God is going to create a new planet and a new galaxy and a new cosmos, that is missing the mark. That's not what the New Testament says. But if they say, oh, the earth is going to burn, it's going to destroy, who cares about creation care and stewardship? It doesn't matter. No. Don't you see that Jesus's body bears the scars from his crucifixion? Now, I don't know what that means for creation, but it does make you wonder, what if our scars on creation will still be there in the new creation, and our stewardship of this creation will show up in the new creation? I don't know. But the end of 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about resurrection so much in the return of Christ, he says, nothing we do in the Lord will be in vain. So there is a continuity between this creation and the next. Somehow the work echoes into it. Again, I cannot say how. I do not know how exactly. But Christ's own death and resurrection is a paradigm for that. Both Wright and Moltmann agree on the insufficiency of secular and modern Christian eschatologies. We'll talk about some of those in a moment. The insufficiency of secular and modern Christian eschatologies. And then finally, both Wright and Moltmann believe that if you get your eschatology right, you'll get the mission of the church right. There's so much that can be said here. Listen, American evangelicalism, because they thought that our hope was the immortal soul going to heaven as opposed to hell, has made the mission of the church saving souls. And meanwhile, we've left systems of injustice and wickedness intact because we thought, who cares? But if you understand that our Christian hope is that the kingdom of God is going to arrive on earth as it is in heaven, and all things will be made new and renewed, then the mission of the church is, yes, evangelism and the announcement of the forgiveness of sins, and it is justice, and it is service, and it is care for creation. It is all of those things. Why? Because if our hope is resurrection and new creation, then our mission is much more than saving souls. Man, I could preach on this for a long time, but this is what really changes our paradigm. This, and both Wright and Moltmann are strong about this. If you get your eschatology wrong, if you get your vision of hope wrong, you get your mission of the church wrong. If we are immortal souls that are going to fly away to heaven, then who really cares about racism or violence or abortion? Or who cares, as long as we get souls saved? But if you understand that the mission, that the Christian hope is for the reign of God to arrive in such a way that renews all things, then the mission of the church is meant to anticipate that even now. Okay. Where do Wright and Moltmann disagree? There's a couple of places. They disagree on the reasons for renewing creation. This gets a little bit technical. I won't say much about that. They also disagree on the overlapping of ages and the inauguration of the kingdom of God. Wright says, the kingdom has broken in, but we're not fully there. I side with Wright on all three of these, actually. And then universal salvation. Moltmann is a universalist. He got to the place where he said, well, everyone eventually be saved. Wright says, no, there has to be the possibility that people, as much as God woos them, people will refuse. It's at least remains a possibility. So they disagreed on three of those points. A lot more could be said there. We'll leave that for now. So where does that leave us? Well, let me give you a couple of summary remarks about Moltmann and Wright. Moltmann and Wright have overlapping yet different centers to their vision of Christian hope. The core of Christian hope for Moltmann is the presence of God, and for Wright, it is the faithfulness of God. Moltmann, the systematician, emphasizes the coming of God as the great Shekinah, the glory, that will fill the cosmos. The focus is on the presence of God coming and filling of all things, or filling all things. The cosmos will be completed and renewed to be fit for such a filling. So because God's coming to fill the world itself will be renewed to be fit for that filling. That's kind of how Moltmann emphasizes it. But for Wright, the Pauline scholar, he emphasizes the faithfulness of God. The covenant narrative is paramount for Wright. It is within that narrative that he finds God being faithful not only as Yahweh, but on behalf of unfaithful Israel as well. It is this faithfulness that is good news for the world. God does not scrap his project, i.e. creation, forget his promise, i.e. the covenant with Abraham to bless all nations through his family, or abandon his people, Israel. While he certainly draws out themes such as victory from the resurrection, and the resurrection is, for Wright, the consummate picture of the faithfulness of God. We have now talked about the hope of the early church, the Nicene Creed, Moltmann and Wright, which both of them in different ways deal with the space of hope and the time of hope. Moltmann, the coming of God, presence; Wright, the faithfulness of God, kind of agency. How do we put all of this together? We're near the end now. We will expand now the structural elements of a hope that we listed earlier and expand it to 7 facets. There's an act of hope. There's a grounds of hope. There's an object of hope. There's an agency of hope. There's a pathway for hope. There's a space of hope. And there's a time, a when of hope. And if we were to try to use all of these dimensions, all of these facets, and put them together in one very complex definition, we would say this: Christian hope is a confident assurance, which is the act, grounded in God's promise and faithfulness, as revealed in the scriptures in general and in Christ in particular. There's your grounds. That the triune God, there's the agency, will bring about the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. That's the object, the what. At the time of Christ's appearing, that's the when, the time. Making heaven and earth new and one, that's the space, the where. By means of what has already been accomplished at the resurrection of Jesus, that's the pathway. That's a very long and dense definition. But I want you to notice for a moment just how different this is from some of the other things we've said. So think for a moment about how different this is. I'm just going to pull up my notes here. Just look for a moment about how different this is than optimism. It's different than that because now all of a sudden we are saying, no, there's a grounds here. There's not just the sense that this is going to happen and we hope. The optimism has no grounds. And it's not just progress. It's not the idea that we can bring this about. We can't bring about the return of Christ. So it's not optimism. It's not progress. It's not even an escape. Why? Because we've said here that it's about making heaven and earth new and one. So this is not escaping it, but renewing and joining together of heaven and earth. And it's not even a return to Eden. So maybe it's helpful to use some really simple drawings here that I've just worked out. This helps me visualize. I need to visualize, what does this look like? If history is a timeline with a telos, we've already said there's a linear view of history. The secular vision of hope is progress. So am I for progress? Yes, I'm for progress. I'm very grateful for medical progress, scientific progress, social progress. I'm interested in progress. But ultimately, my hope is not progress. The progress is a secular version of hope that says that we can just get better and better and better if we try hard enough, if we have the right education, if we have the right systems. But what I love about reading the preaching of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is I've been reading some of his sermons recently, and he talks about our ultimate hope not being in our ability to make progress. And he says we need to work for progress. And he often said, I would rather a good humanist than a bad Christian. And what he meant by that is at least a good humanist will make this world a better place. A bad Christian will do nothing. But so progress is a good thing. But at the end of the day, that's not our hope. That's not Christian hope. Neither is it escape. Now, I've gone a little crazy with my drawing here, but if you look at the straight line, human history is going along. Then there's the fall of humanity. And we sort of think, oh, man, there's a fall. We're going straight to hell. But Jesus came and poof, we get to escape to this other plane of existence. It's almost like there's two planes of reality, and this one was headed downward. And we said, whoa, bail, we got to get out of here. And Jesus says, whoop, I'm going to airlift you. And it's like we get airlifted out of the danger and we go join this other plane of existence called the eternal heaven. I want to say to you that though this sounds like a Christianity, it is a uniquely American evangelical view of hope that is relatively new. It's about 100, 150 years. It became popular, especially though in the 1950s, Billy Graham, all of that stuff. We just began to imagine that there's some other plane of existence and God will lift us out of here to go there. But again, this was not the hope of the early Christians. This was not how Paul wrote. This is actually much more like Plato and his vision of an immortal soul and the soul's going away to its actual home. And that on earth, we're in our cage. We're like a bird in the cage. And then death is the opening of the cage and the freeing of the bird. That is not the kind of preaching of Christian hope. When I do funerals, I make sure to never say anything like that. That's not what we're looking for. But here's another one that almost sounds correct. There's Eden, there's the fall in a downward slide, and then salvation, woof, returns us to Eden. We're going back to the garden. Have you ever noticed that Genesis begins with a garden and Revelation ends with a garden city? So it's garden-esque, but it's expanded. It's beautiful. There's jewels and diamonds. You can't even describe it. So the story of salvation begins in a garden, but ends in a garden city. You know what that means? It means that this salvation, this hope that we have is not just a return to Eden. It's not just a restoration. It's not a recapitulation to the beginning. No, it's something very different than that. And it's difficult to draw, but I've tried with these lines. So here's our human story. Sin and death tip the line down. Jesus comes into our world, the incarnation, his own. I should have put crucifixion and resurrection. He lived, he died, he was buried, he was raised. And he is coming again. And when he comes again, he will, what that line is there is it's not a line up to a separate plane, AKA heaven. It is taking that original human story and bending it, taking it back up to what it was supposed to be. So you see, I've written on the top, the completion and perfection of creation. What new creation is not a return to Eden or an escape to heaven. It's the completion and perfection of creation. It's where the story was always meant to go. It's the telos God always had in mind. This is how I understand Ephesians 1, where Paul's talking about predestination. I understand it as God had a destination in mind for creation, but sin derailed us. Sin took us on a wrong track, on a detour, and salvation was God doing the improbable, the impossible, and somehow putting the story back on track so all who are in Christ can now participate in the completion and perfection of creation. Somebody say amen. Okay, so if we wanted to take our paragraph complex summary of Christian hope and just say it simply, I think you could say it in one sentence this way. Christian hope is resurrection and new creation. It's resurrection and new creation. It's Jesus's resurrection. It's our coming resurrection. It's the new creation of all things and all that entails together. There are some research bits that I had thought about including today, but we are out of time. We really need to get to questions. So let's go ahead. The research bits was really just about surveying worship leaders and how they answered. Well, let me just show you two slides. And this might be helpful to you. So think, well, where are we today? Oh, somehow there's something that's drawing on my slide here. I don't know how that's happening. Let's think about, so I gave these 4 statements to 1,000 worship leaders. God will set it right one day. God will explain it to me one day. God will get me out of here one day. Or God will make it up to me one day. Now, I didn't give them the clue phrases beside it: new creation, explanation, evacuation, compensation. I didn't have that. I just had these phrases, and I asked them to rank them in order of which they thought reflected their hope the most. And here's a breakdown. I broke it down. It was partly for my own research reasons that I broke it down into Presbyterian worship leaders and Pentecostal charismatic worship leaders. The national worship leaders is everybody. That was all sort of 1,000 responses. Presbyterians was about 200. Pentecostal charismatic, I think, was like 300 or 400. So, or maybe it was slightly less than that. But this is just an interesting thing of where are we today? Well, this is one slice of what people think. Generally, the worship leaders that I surveyed put new creation as the highest. God will set it right one day, or at least that phrase, God will set it right. And then they chose God will explain it to me. And then they chose God will get me out of here. And then God will make it up to me. It was interesting. The Presbyterians did not have any sense of compensation that God will make it up to me. A much stronger sense of God will set it right one day. And then the Pentecostal charismatic ones had the largest slice of God will get me out of here one day. So I'll let you come up with your own conclusions of why charismatics are looking to escape. I offer that without much comment. And they were also the least likely group to talk about God setting it right one day. All right.